Welcome to part 5 of our lecture. Here we're looking at organisational power and structure. So I don't expect you to know this particular content in depth. I just wanted to expose you to this idea of where power lies in different sorts of organisational structures, just because I thought it might have some relevance for some of you in your group case study reports. So this is drawing on work by a scholar called Charles Handy, and it's drawing out of the Cacciatolo 2014 paper, thinking about, okay, for different organisational structures, where can we generalise power generally lies? So again, just to have a bit of a surface knowledge of this. So let's work through them each. You can see you've got some text on the left and you've got a visual there on the right that I hope helps to explicate what this is talking about. So a power culture, that is an organisation with a power culture, can be symbolised as a web. So basically, the red dot can be the CEO. I mean, often you'll see power cultures in startups or small organisations, entrepreneurial organisations that have not necessarily a very large staff. So what that means is that power and control actually stems from the centre. So it's like a web stemming out from that red dot in the centre there. What this tells us, these types of organisations can be quite political because decisions are generally taken by persuasion rather than on bureaucratic or a rational basis. And the reason for that is because they're often in smaller organisations. There's not a whole lot of rules or regulations or policies, structures or systems in place. So it's generally just about interpersonal interactions between staff members and more senior people or senior person in the organisation. So that's what we mean by persuasion or influence, rather than logical systems of influence or rational or expert systems of influence that Mintzberg talks about, that we mentioned earlier in this lecture. It's not necessarily based on those things. It's based on interpersonal interaction. So that's a power culture. Power stems from a central person, often the CEO or the entrepreneur in the organisation. A role culture is almost the inverse. So this is where you might see it in, more larger, bureaucratic, hierarchical, more complex organisations. A visual here is often a Greek temple, because here the culture works by logic and rationality, as you can see in the text there. So you can see in the visual, and I'm going backwards, you can see in the visual that it sort of runs through like an organisational chart. So power stems from each of these different roles in the organisation. So you can think about legitimate power here. So for example, if we come to some of this text, so these pillars often include, so these pillars being parts of the organisation you can see in the chart, often include finance department, purchasing, HR, etc. It's the interaction between these departments or teams is often controlled by rules and procedures, because these are bureaucracies. This is what role cultures are about. So these sorts of organisations are generally risk averse, they're loss averse, they're change averse. And so it can take a long time for innovations to move through these sorts of organisations. We were talking about power tools before, what Cantor talked about in terms of power tools needing to borrow sources of power from other people. This type of role culture and this type of organisational structure is really stereotypical of what that means. So if you're very junior in the organisation, if you're sitting down here, for example, you probably need to borrow the power sources of people who are more senior at higher levels of the organisation in order to push innovations through. So here, in a role culture, power is very much defined by legitimate power, the position that you have in the organisation. A task culture can still occur in larger organisations, but it's more job-oriented and it's more focused on where individuals work as a team. So here, as you can see in the second line here, power is derived only from expertise and only where required. So where role cultures are more about deriving power from legitimate sources or legitimate power, task cultures exist in organisations that might be quite highly technical, for example, quite highly expertise oriented. And so this, as you can see here, this organisation is much like a net. So we've got what we might call a multifunctional organisational structure here, or a matrix structure. And so much of the power and influence lies at the intersections of each of these nets. So here the task culture is about getting the job done, getting it done well, logically and rationally applying resources to get that job done. And often it's about compliance. So power here really sits with teams, I suppose, particularly teams doing critical work, because it's about expert power in these sorts of organisations. And finally, a person culture is unusual, as the first line suggests of that paragraph. Individuals believe themselves to be superior to the organisation they're employed in. So there's some overlap here with the task culture, I suppose. In these sorts of organisations, employees often have expert power, so the power base is usually expert, as you can see here. Individuals do what they're good at, and they often do that very well. And individuals in this type of culture can sometimes be difficult to manage. Often it's because their skills are in such high demand because they have such a high level of expert power. It's easier for them to go and find a job somewhere else. So here, a person culture, power derives from, again, from expertise, but individuals, often it can feel like they're working quite separately in this organisation. So it's, I guess, quite individually focused, as the person culture term suggests. And power derives from individuals within the organisation rather than necessarily teams, which is what task culture is about. So just have a general sense of what those mean. You don't need to know about them in depth. It's just to give you another tool, I suppose, to use if it's relevant for your particular group case study, to understand where power lies in different organisational structures generally. Flying on from that, I also wanted to just briefly introduce you to another tool, I guess, just for your toolkit and a tool that you might use for your analysis in your group case study reports. Stakeholder analysis. So this is probably a term that you've used. Very broadly, what it means is, look, whenever you're engaging in a project, for our purposes, whenever you might be thinking about a particular innovation, there are obviously individuals who will benefit from it and individuals who may not, individuals who might care about it and individuals who do not, individuals who might be apathetic about it, indifferent, etc. Those are all stakeholders. The power of a stakeholder analysis is that it forces us to think about who are those individuals who can have an impact on my particular project or innovation, whether it's a positive or a negative impact. It can help you understand that individuals' interests and positions, their capacity or willingness to oppose an innovation, influence other groups, the sort of power bases they might be coming from, whether there's power bases that you can leverage and that you can borrow from, access other people's power tools. It also gets you to explicitly think about how might we manage these different interests, these different stakeholders, etc. So I've got the Kennan et al. Paper as a reading for this module. Again, I think it's a pretty easy read. It's not too dense. Basically, they talk about a stakeholder analysis tool that they developed. I like it because I think it's fairly simple and intuitive. If you search, you can find lots of research on stakeholder analysis tools. So please, if this is something you think is highly relevant to your group case study report, or something of particular interest for you, perhaps for your reflective assessment piece, please feel free to go and search widely, research more into stakeholder analysis, and perhaps you might find some tools or methods that resonate with you some more. But in this Kennan et al. Paper, they basically set up a matrix, ultimately where they're trying to identify enablers of an innovation and influencers of an innovation across the two axes there. So influencers are those individuals who might have funding or other resources they can devote to your particular project. They might have legitimate or positional authority, legitimate power. They might also have some influencing strategies and tactics that they can engage in on your behalf. And enablers can be about expert power, those who have critical knowledge. There might be opinion leaders. We'll come on to opinion leaders when we get to diffusion of innovation and behaviour change. They're very critical individuals in terms of innovation adoption. Enablers can also provide enabling resources, similarly to influencers, and they might be quite critical in the delivery of a project or innovation. So you might just then, what you do here is you identify different stakeholders, you then map where they sit on these different axes, and you can get a sense of, okay, who are the people that are really important, that I really need to influence well or really need to keep informed, highly informed. Identify those people. Who are the individuals who might have some interest, but I don't really need to keep them informed all the time, etc. It can just help to shape not just how you think about where power is and what political activity you might need to engage in, but what sort of influencing you need to engage in. And you can see I've got in bold down the bottom there. Please also don't forget to identify disablers through this process. So that's people who can exert a negative influence on the design or delivery of an innovation. The Kennan et al. Paper actually identifies that these individuals can often be forgotten in stakeholder analyses, but as you can imagine, disablers are particularly important to identify because they're the ones that can thwart you or can stop an innovation in its tracks. So just take this very generally. It's just one tool you can use, stakeholder analysis, to start to map the different people that are involved in innovation and get you thinking about how you might apply these other concepts that we're talking about. Social network analysis. Who are the people that are very central in an organisation? Influencing strategies. For who do I need to influence? What sort of messages should I be using? How should I be using those messages? Thinking about innovation champions that we'll come to in a later lecture. Thinking about innovation, adoption, and diffusion and behaviour change. Thinking about opinion leaders. Again, those central people in organisational networks. And again, here, table 1 I thought was just useful. I've just pasted it in here. Again, you can step from this matrix here to actually then identifying for each particular stakeholder. And you can see it's Bob here, and he's a farmer. You can identify for each of these different things, okay, why is this person important? Where are they in the matrix? So you can see they've got the letter I there. So they're sitting around probably not a highly enabling individual, I being here, but somewhat influential. Okay, given that, what's their attitude toward my innovation? What would I like them to do? What are the key messages or influencing tactics I can engage in, when and how, etc. So that's where you actually start to map out how do we manage these stakeholders that we have identified. Okay, we'll take a break, and then the very last thing I want to talk about is political skill.